Hello, Sunny.
네,
I am glad that you safely returned from your trip, and I thank you for taking my question. My question's related to a close relative of mine. This relative is someone about my same age that we grew up in the same town, and so we were very close to each other when we were children. And my relative is very smart and went to a very good university, but um, in our later life, we surmised my relative has never been diagnosed, but we surmised probably has high functioning autism. But back in the 1970s, when we were children, most people weren't aware of things like Asperger's disease, and so went undiagnosed. And I'm guessing as a result of that, has suffered from social anxiety and depression for a lot of their life. When they graduated from this very good university, they got they were what we would consider to be underemployed. They took jobs that were kind of menial tasks and things that they they didn't need a college education to do, because they provided them opportunities to not be in socially anxious situations, things like a data entry clerk or something like that. Um, did those kind of menial jobs for about 20 years, and then um, a, over a decade ago was laid off from a job, and then tried for several years to find other similar jobs, but a lot of those jobs no longer exist, and tried to start a business and uh, borrowed money from my family. Uh, at the time, it wasn't a lot of money, but we knew that it was probably more like a gift. So my wife and I gave this family member a gift, not expecting it to ever be repaid, even though it was technically borrowed. Um, None of those jobs or other opportunities have worked out, and so essentially for the past 10 years, my relative has been cashing in their retirement savings and living off that retirement. And I'm guessing that soon that savings will run out. And I don't mind occasionally helping my family member out, but I'm not in a position where I can support them for the rest of their life. And my older relatives, my aunts and uncles and my parents have been, more, suggesting like trying to help this person get a job or trying to help them figure out ways to reduce their costs or that kind of thing. And has largely been rejected and kind of refused that kind of has not gotten a new job for, like I said, over a decade. But has recently started hinting to me that they're going to start asking my older relatives for financial help. And my aunt and uncles and my parents aren't in a situation, they're retired. They don't have a situation where they can't help them out. And I just wonder what kind of suggestion you have, or at least insight onto this situation that you could give. Thank you.
네. 사람은 누구나 다 자기 인생은 자기가 책임지고 살아야 된다. 즉 자립적으로 살아야 합니다.
So everybody should live their lives to own and be autonomous and independent in their own lives.
이것은 사람만이 아니라 이 자연 속에 있는 모든 생물이 다 그렇습니다.
So this just doesn't apply to the human beings, but it applies to every living creature in the nature.
그러나 이 삶이 이 생명이 지속적으로 유지되려면 어린 아이, 이 새끼에 대해서는 일정하게 성년이 될 때까지는 부모가 돌봐야 합니다.
However, for that species, for that group to self-sustain, for the children, the youth of that group needs to be taken care of by the parents until they grow up, become adults.
이것은 자연도 마찬가지입니다.
And that same applies to nature as well.
근데 사람이 늙어서 이제 스스로 살아갈 수 없는 경우가 있습니다.
But there's a situation when people get old and they cannot live by themselves.
자연계에서는 이 문제는 스스로 책임져야지 자식이거나 옆에서 책임지지 않습니다.
In nature, actually, those old or those who cannot take care of themselves are left on their own devices in nature.
그러나 사람들은 스스로 살아갈 수 없는 이런 늙은이들을 우리는 자식이거나 이웃에서 보살핍니다.
But human beings, so human society has evolved that the children or a close neighbor sometimes take care of the old who cannot survive on their own.
그래서 제가 자식을 돌보는 것은 의무사항에 들어가고 부모를 돌보는 것은 선택사항에 들어간다고 말한 것입니다.
That's why I often say that for parents to take care of the child, that's mandatory. However, for a child to take care of their elderly parents, that's optional.
우리 주위에는 이 외에도 우리가 돌봐야 할 사람들이 있습니다.
But besides your old elderly parent, there are others around us that we need to take care of.
병이 들어서 스스로 살아갈 수 없는 사람이 있고요.
There are the sick, so who cannot be self-sufficient.
장애 때문에 그런 경우도 있고요.
There are those who are not self-sufficient due to a disablement and handicap.
갑자기 어떤 사고로 일시적으로 그런 경우도 있습니다.
And there's people who cannot take care of themselves temporarily because of some accident or the other.
옛날에는 이런 것을 우리는 자연처럼 외면했습니다.
In the olden days, we often, left them to themselves, their own fates.
그러나 지금 현대 사회는 이런 사람들도 생존할, 즉 살아갈 권리가 있다 해서 우리는 공동으로 돌봅니다.
But in today's world, we acknowledge that even these people actually have the right to lead their lives, and we tend to create social safety nets to be able to take care of them.
처음에는 주로 가족이 책임이 졌는데 가족에 너무 부담이 크기 때문에 요즘은 사회가 공동으로 이들을 보살피는 것입니다.
So in the beginnings, the family members, so extended family used to take care of these individuals, but the burden on the family has been too large. So right now it's more left up to the society at large.
이것이 우리가 말하는 사회보장 제도라고 할 수 있습니다.
And these are what consists of what we call the, overall the social safety fabric.
우리가 건강하고 수입이 있을 때 우리가 버는 수입 중에 일부 이렇게 세금을 내게 되면 그 돈의 일부를 가지고 모아서 사회 전체가 이런 사람들을 돌보게 되는 것입니다.
So when we are healthy and we work, part of our pay goes to a fund that's being used to take care of the marginalized folks who cannot be, self-sufficient.
그렇기 때문에 이런 아직도 이 사회보장제도가 제대로 갖춰지지 않는 사회에서는 이것이 대부분 가족에게 부담이 되기 때문에 환자라든지 장애인만 삶이 힘든 게 아니고 그런 가족을 둔 나머지 사람들도 삶이 굉장히 힘이 들고 있습니다.
But in nations where the social fabric, the safety net has large gaps, it is still up to the family who needs to take care of primarily these individuals. So it becomes a huge burden not on that individual himself, but also the family needs to take care of him.
그래서 이 질문자의 경우에 어떤 나라에 내가 살고 있느냐에 따라서 문제 해결 방법이 달라집니다.
Therefore, in your case, the solution really varies and depends on which country you live in.
사회보장제도가 잘 되어 있는 사회라면 병원에 가서 진단을 받고 그 진단의 결과로 이런 사회보장 시스템에 신청을 하게 되면 거기서 일부 혜택을 받을 수 있습니다.
In those countries with a strong social safety net, you would take that individual to a hospital, get official diagnosis, and if there's a need that needs to be provided, it will be provided by the society.
거기에 어떤 등급이 있습니다. 장애의 등급이라든지 정신질환의 등급이라든지 그런 등급이 있어서 그에 따라서 일정한 지원이 나오게 됩니다.
And the resource that's provided and support that's provided to the individual really depends on different ranks, of that ranks that individual by the type of needs and the amount of needs that individual needs.
제가 아는 미국에 사는 어떤 청년인데요. 정신적인 질환이 심각하고 감정 조절이 전혀 안 돼서 사회생활을 할 수가 없었습니다.
So I knew this young person who was living in the U.S. who had, mental illness as well as trouble controlling his emotions. So he was not really, fit to live in a normal society.
네, 처음에는 가족들이 어떻게든 학교를 보내고 정상적인 생활을 시켜보려고 많은 애를 쓰고 돈도 들이고 외국인과 결혼도 시켜보고 온갖 노력을 했습니다.
In the beginning, the family members tried to kind of fit him into normal society as much as possible, forcing him to go to school, spending money on different hospitals, different treatments, or even getting him married.
그러나 그 모든 것이 가족이 감당하기에는 어려웠습니다.
But all that, became naught, and it was really tough. The burden was too much for the family to bear by themselves.
가족이 자기 생계를 유지하는 사업보다는 그 자식한테 전적으로 매달려서 가족 전체가 힘든 생활을 했습니다.
Instead of really being able to focus on their livelihood, the whole family had to really spend all their time and resources on that one person.
그러나 결국은 병원에 진찰을 받고 고가의 신청을 하고 이것은 간단하게 진료될 수 있는 그런 질환이 아니다. 이렇게 되면서 모든 치료비 그리고 생활비까지 정부에서 지원을 하게 됐습니다.
But ultimately, they went to the hospital, got an official diagnosis, and said this was a complex diagnosis or illness. And based on that diagnosis, they were able to be provided, societal public resources and public aid.
물론 지금 가족이 함께 살고 있지만은 그 생활비가 대부분 정부에서 일정한 생활비가 지급이 되고 있습니다.
Although the individual is still living with his family, most of the resources and the costs necessary to keep that individual are being provided by the state.
제가 이렇게 길게 말하지 않아도 저는 본인들이 충분히 잘 알고 있을 거라고 생각합니다.
And I'm sure I didn't need to repeat all this because I'm sure you're well aware of these different benefits, public benefits, and opportunities that you have.
그래서 첫째, 진찰을 정확하게 해서 병의 상태가 어느 정도인지를 먼저 확인을 해야 합니다.
So therefore, I think first and foremost, it's important to get an accurate medical diagnosis to see about the real nature and the severity of the whatever condition is suffering from.
네, 이것을 숨기거나 또는 가족이 계속 책임지는 것은 현실적으로 어렵습니다.
And realistically, it's impossible to cover up any diagnosis at this point or hide it, or for the family by themselves to take care of it.
부모는 그래도 희생을 하려고 하는데 형제나 또는 친척은 그렇게 할 수가 없습니다.
Parents might, want to take care of their child to the end, but, a sibling or an extended relative will not be able to.
왜냐하면 형제는 자기 개인은 그렇게 조금 도울 수 있을지 몰라도 결혼을 하게 되면 남편 아내가 있어서 새로운 가정이 꾸려지기 때문에 이렇게 남의 가정에 일정하게 책임을 지는 것을 누구도 받아들이지 않습니다.
And a sibling, when he's not married, might be able to provide aid somewhat. But, if a sibling, he or she gets married, then, they have their own families to take care of, and they're not able to kind of sacrifice the resource for their family for somebody else.
그래서 첫 번째는 병을 정확하게 진단하고 정부의 이 상황을 보고해서 어떤 병의 등급을 이렇게 장애의 등급을 받고 거기에서 첫째 지원을 받아야 합니다.
So first, it's important to get an accurate medical diagnosis and report that through the proper channels to the state, and if eligible, receive whatever public aid or public support that you are eligible for.
두 번째는 이러한 사람은 일정한 직업을 갖는다 하더라도 이렇게 공동으로 일하는 데는 적당하지 않습니다.
And second, even if such an individual is able to get a job, the nature of the job cannot be something that's in a social setting.
대부분 이렇게 혼자서 하는 간단한 일을 해야 합니다.
He's probably more conducive to working by himself and are more of a repetitive, simple task.
그것을 개인이 구할 수도 있지만은 이런 정부의 장애 등급을 받게 되면 정부에서 이런 많은 회사에 알아서 그런 직업을 구해주기도 합니다.
Of course, you can get a job by yourself, but if you report his diagnosis to the state, I'm sure the state has programs by which, you allow those opportunities, job opportunities, to be made available to such individuals.
또 정부에서는 회사에 그런 장애를 가진 사람을 이렇게 채용하게 되면 정부에서 그 장애자의 월급의 일부를 보조해주는 이런 제도도 있습니다.
And the state have, public programs by which they supplement the pay of these individuals if a company hires them.
만약에 한국 같으면 북한에서 온 사람들을 회사가 채용을 하게 되면 3년간 월급의 절반을 정부가 보조해 준다든지 이런 제도가 있습니다.
For example, in South Korea, it's in a similar way. If a company hires a North Korean refugees who have escaped from North Korea and arrived in the South, then for the first 3 years of their career in that company, half of their pay is paid by the state.
그러니까 회사는 자기가 전액 부담하는 게 아니라 정부에서 일부 부담하기 때문에 그래도 비교적 쉽게 채용을 합니다.
And that makes it easier for the North Korean refugees to get a job because there's an economic incentive for the firms to hire them.
그러니까 그러한 어떤 제도가 있는지를 먼저 알아봐야 합니다.
So it's important to find out, to discover if whether such an opportunity exists for an individual.
이런 분이 개인 사업을 한다는 것은 현실적으로 성공할 가능성이 매우 낮습니다.
And for such a person to actually successfully run his own business, the possibility of success is very low.
그것도 만약에 방법을 찾을 수 없다면 이제 정부에서 나오는 적은 돈과 가족들이 관심이 있다면 조금씩 모아서 보충해서 지원한 방법은 있을 겁니다.
And there's possibilities that you can actually combine resources, whatever you get from the state, and maybe the family members, extended family, can chip in a little bit and provide that aid.
또 NGO에서 저희들 같은 이런 NGO에서 그런 사람들을 또 어떻게 지원하는 이런 프로그램도 있습니다.
And there are a lot of programs by NGOs like us, like nonprofits, who cater to supporting individuals like that.
그러니까 친구로서 이웃으로서 내가 할 수 있는 것은 이런 것을 찾아서 도와주는 겁니다.
So as a friend, as a neighbor, what you can do is try to find these opportunities, in order to kind of make them available to that individual.
내가 개인적으로 여유가 있으면 조금은 도울 수 있겠지만은 어떤 한 사람의 생활을 이렇게 완전하게 책임지는 것은 오래 하기가 힘듭니다.
And if he has had some spare resources, once or twice, you may be able to help out, but very difficult one individual to really fully take care of another individual for the rest of their life.
그리고 반드시 도울 때에는 가족 구성원들, 내 가족 구성원들의 합의하에 동의를 얻어서 해야지 내가 안다고 내가 일방적으로 결정한다면 가족 구성원들과의 갈등이 생깁니다.
And if you want to help, you should help in discussions and in concurrence with other family members, and you don't help, arbitrarily on your own.
그러니까 마음이 아프지만은 반드시 개인적으로 도울 때는 가족 구성원과 합의하는 만큼 도와야 된다 하는 것을 말씀드리고 싶습니다.
You may want to help more. Your heart may be aching, but if you want to help as an individual, you should do it with concurrence in discussion with the rest of the family members.
네, 더 질문이 있습니까?
Do you have any follow-up question?
Not really a follow-up question. I appreciate your suggestion about getting a diagnosis, but this I guess it's hard to know what goes on inside other people's heads. This relative presents as again very high functioning, and to like a casual observer would not have any idea that they are suffering or that they have or have a diagnosable illness. And so I'm very skeptical about the likelihood of getting any kind of disability benefits of that kind of so it's again it's your advice is all very sound, but I just don't know where I guess I just don't think it's likely to be helpful. I guess the advice I need to hear is just your reassurance that it's should be a team effort, and it's not my individual responsibility.
뭐 제가 생각할 때는 한 80~90%는 정신적 질환이라고 볼 수 있습니다.
I think, as you said, as you described, 80 to 90%, I'm sure there's a mental illness there.
정신적인 질환은 이렇게 바깥의 눈으로 보이지 않습니다.
And mental illness are not visible to the eye.
뭐 항상 그 질병이 이렇게 일어나는 것은 아닙니다.
Because the illness doesn't always show up.
하루에 한 번 일어날 수도 있고 한 달에 한 번 일어날 수도 있습니다.
It can only show up once a day or once a month.
그렇기 때문에 이것이 발생하지 않을 때는 본인이 얘기한 대로 멀쩡합니다. 아무 문제도 없습니다.
So it often seems like that person is perfectly normal.
그러나 이것이 발병하게 되면 함께하기가 어렵습니다.
But once the illness kind of starts expressing itself, it's very hard to be with that person.
그렇기 때문에 육체가 멀쩡하다고 큰 문제가 없지 않을까 이렇게 생각하는데 대부분 부모들이 그렇게 생각해서 이 치료를 놓치게 됩니다.
And so just because, physically the person is fine doesn't mean mentally it's fine. But most often, parents actually kind of trick themselves with hope just based on the physical appearance alone.
그냥 성격이 문제다. 자꾸 이렇게 생각합니다.
They often think it's just a personality flaw.
그런데 그게 본인이 스스로 어떻게 할 수가 없습니다.
But, that person himself cannot really control it.
네, 그래서 첫째 진찰을 받아야 됩니다.
That's why accurate medical diagnosis is important.
그리고 그 결과에 따라서 사회의 지원을 받아야 됩니다.
And depending on the results, you need public support.
만약에 진찰에 이상이 없다면 그것은 자기는 일체 관여하지 않는 게 좋습니다. 병원 진찰 결과에 건강상 이상이 없다면 아무리 그가 어렵게 살아도 특별히 자기 책임을 안 져도 된다. 일정한 거리를 두고 사는 수밖에 없다는 겁니다.
But if the medical diagnosis does not come back with, definitively, or it says that he's not suffering really a mental illness, I mean, there's no responsibility, for you to have to help, and you can just keep a certain distance between you and himself.
처음 말씀드렸지만은 건강에 이상이 없다면 자기 인생은 어떻게 살든 자기가 책임을 져야 됩니다.
Because unless there is something, in terms of some disability of some type, you are responsible for your own life.
만약에 내 가족 중에 홈리스가 있다 하더라도 어쩔 수 없습니다.
You can't do anything about it, even if that individual happens to be part of your family.
그 부담 가질 필요가 없습니다.
So you don't have to feel burdened.
그런 가족을 둔 우리는 바로 이렇게 합리적 해결책을 찾거나 그렇지 않으면 해결책이 없다면 그것은 인생살이에서 우리가 어떻게 할 수 없는 일에 속한다. 너무 부담 가질 필요가 없다는 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다.
And if you are part of the family that has, such an individual in your family, either you can help, or if there's situations in our lives that we encounter, that you can't really help, or that you can't really address in a rational way.
네, 사람의 사는 길이 서로 다르기 때문에 본인이 그렇게 살겠다는데 어떻게 할 수가 없잖아요.
And if somebody, chooses to live his or her life in a certain way, there's nothing you can do.
Just added information. This doesn't really change everything all that much, but my
많은 걸 바꾸진 않지만
my relative does have regular meetings with physician and has been diagnosed with
의사랑 만나고 있고요.
anxiety and does take medication for the anxiety, and it has helped quite a lot for the anxiety. Which is why I think that if there were other serious problems, that it would have been like disability, it would have been diagnosed and would have been brought to the fore already. The thing that I do take home from your message to me, however, is the reiteration of your principle of that it's parents who take care of the children until they are of adult age, and then it's the society. If there are people who need more help, it's the society. So I think that in this case, it just reiterated the fact that I can do what I can do, but I can't do things that I can't do, and I can rely on society and the rest of my family to help my relative or not.
네, 첫째는 병원 진료를 받고 있다니까 다행이고요. 그다음에 두
It's good to
번째,
hear that he's getting regular physical checkups.
두 번째는 그 정도의 병을 가지고 직업을 구할 수 없기 때문에 당연히 실업 신청을 해야 되겠죠.
And of course, because he's disabled and he cannot get a job, he obviously needs to apply for unemployment insurance.
또 그에 맞게 생활을 검소하게 해야 되겠죠. 살아야 되겠죠.
Of course, then he has to live within his means, modestly.
또 친구나 친척으로서 우리가 작은 도움이라도 줄 수 있으면 좋겠죠.
Of course, it'd be great if he can get some help from his relatives and families.
우리가 친척도 아니고 먼 나라, 다른 사람들도 어렵다면 우리가 돕지 않습니까?
You know what? We're generous and we help others we're strangers to us, right?
네, 그렇기 때문에 정말 생활이 어렵다면 가족과 의논해서 일정하게 돕는 게 좋습니다.
And so if that person is truly having a hard time making ends meet, then it's good for the families to be able to pitch in.
그 질병이 좀 있다 하더라도 그것이 어떤 사회가 공동으로 지원해야 할 만한 그런 질병이 아니라면 어떻게 살든 그건 그 사람의 인생이지 내가 지나치게 걱정할 일은 아니라는 거예요.
But even if there's some kind of disability, if not, it's not of severity, to be officially recognized or some subject to being eligible to be taken care of with public support, then it's best to leave that person to live his own life, however he may be, and it's not up to us to overly interfere.
제가 말씀드리는 것은 이걸 어떻게 대응할 거냐 하는 그런 기술적인 얘기, 방법적인 얘기를 하는 게 아니라 이런 사람을 친척이나 가족으로 두고도 내가 근심 걱정 없이 어떻게 살 것인가 하는 것이 항상 수행의 과제입니다.
But what I really want to deliver and communicate to you, Lee, is that not the different availability or opportunities for public aid or support for such a person. Is that even if you have such a person and this disability within your family, how can you, as yourself, live free from suffering and guarantee your own happiness?
우리가 살아가는 데는 온갖 일들이 일어납니다.
Because a lot of things happen to us in our lives.
우리는 어떤 것은 해결하고 어떤 것은 해결이 못하기도 합니다.
And some we can address, some we can't.
그 속에 내가 마음의 평화를 유지해야 된다는 것입니다.
In the midst of all that, maintain the peace of in my mind.
이것이 수행의 관점입니다.
And that is the perspective that practice brings.
제가 어려운 곳을 가서 보고 그들의 삶이 너무 열악하다고 그곳에서 울고 앉아 있다면 그것은 수행적 관점이 아닙니다.
So if I were to go to a place, that's in pain, then I see all the pain, all the suffering around me, and I sit down and cry, that's not the right perspective to bring as a spiritual practitioner.
그들의 얘기를 듣고 그들이 무엇을 원하는지 그중에 내가 무엇을 할 수 있는 데를 찾아서 그들에게 도움을 줄 수 있는 길을 찾는 것이 수행자의 길입니다.
A spiritual practitioner should look for opportunities to help them by listening to their pain, to listening to their needs, and articulating what they would need and try to help them.
좋은 일이라 하더라도 내가 다 할 수는 없지 않습니까? 내가 할 수 있는 만큼 내가 하는 겁니다.
So I can't do all the good things in the world that I want to. I can only do what I can.